Long before the first empire raised its banners, before temples rose from mud brick or kings carved their names into stone, something occurred that should not have been possible. A civilization remembered events older than itself. It spoke of gods who walked, judged, fought, and died, beings bound not by eternity, but by law. Why would a people who mastered agriculture, mathematics, and writing describe their gods as limited? Why would they speak of divine fear, divine punishment, divine death? Why would the earliest written stories of humanity portray creation not as harmony, but as conflict, rebellion, and consequence? And why would these stories survive intact across millennia, carved into clay, waiting to be read again? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Long before the rise of empires, and long before written history was thought possible, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers began to shape something unprecedented. In this wide alluvial plain, where seasonal floods deposited rich silt and turned dust into abundance, human communities transformed from wandering groups into organized societies bound by agriculture, labor, and belief. This region, later called Mesopotamia, did not merely give rise to cities. It produced the very concept of civilization. Its people did not just build homes and temples, they built memory itself. The earliest inhabitants of this land learned to tame the unpredictable rivers through canals and irrigation networks that required cooperation on a massive scale. Managing water meant managing people, and managing people required systems of order. From this necessity emerged structured authority, social hierarchy, and eventually writing. The invention of writing was not born from poetry or myth, but from accounting. Clay tablets were impressed with marks to track grain, livestock, and labor. Over time, these marks evolved from simple tallies into symbols capable of expressing ideas, sounds, and eventually entire narratives. This transformation changed humanity forever. For the first time, thought could exist outside the mind. Memory could outlive the speaker. Knowledge could accumulate rather than vanish with each generation. Writing became a bridge between the living and the dead, between past and future. And within that bridge, the earliest stories of gods and creation were preserved. The people who created this system are known to us as the Sumerians. They did not see themselves as primitive or emerging. They believed they lived in a world already shaped by divine order. To them, the universe was not random or accidental. It was governed by powers that existed long before humanity and would continue long after. These powers were not abstract concepts, but beings with names, personalities, and domains. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki were not distant or unknowable forces. They were present in every aspect of life. They governed storms and rivers, fertility and death, justice and kingship. Each city was under the protection of a specific deity, and the well-being of that city depended on maintaining favor with its divine patron. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were administrative centers, storehouses, and symbols of cosmic order made visible on earth. To understand how deeply the divine was woven into daily life, one must understand how the Sumerians viewed existence itself. They did not separate the natural from the supernatural. A flood was not merely excess rain. It was an expression of divine will. A successful harvest was not luck but favor. Disease was not random misfortune, but imbalance or displeasure. Every event existed within a moral and cosmic framework governed by higher powers. These gods were not distant creators who withdrew from the world after shaping it. They were active participants, constantly involved in human affairs. They demanded offerings, obedience, and respect, and in return they provided protection, fertility, and order. Their favor was never guaranteed. It had to be earned, maintained, and constantly renewed through ritual and devotion. Yet these gods were not portrayed as perfect or omniscient. They quarreled, envied, feared, and made mistakes. They were powerful, but not all-powerful. They were eternal, but not beyond consequence. This paradox lies at the heart of Sumerian theology and separates it from later monotheistic traditions. In Sumerian thought, divinity did not mean moral perfection. It meant authority, hierarchy, and proximity to the forces that shaped reality. Among these gods, a particular group stood apart. They were not simply deities of a single city or function, but figures who occupied the highest tier of the divine order. They were judges, administrators, and enforcers of cosmic law. These were the Anunnaki. The name itself carried weight. It referred to those of royal blood, the offspring of the highest god, bound together by authority and responsibility. They were not creators in the sense of forming the universe from nothing. Instead, they governed what already existed, ensuring that the cosmic structure remained stable. They were arbiters rather than architects. In the myths preserved on clay tablets, the Anunnaki appear most often in moments of judgment. They are summoned to decide fate, to weigh guilt, to determine outcomes that affect both gods and mortals. Their presence is solemn, heavy, and final. When they speak, their words are not suggestions but verdicts. When they act, their actions reshape destiny itself. One of the most striking aspects of these texts is the way the Anunnaki are portrayed as bound by law themselves. They do not act freely or arbitrarily. They convene, deliberate, and follow established cosmic rules. Even the greatest gods are subject to these laws. This concept of a structured universe governed by order rather than chaos was fundamental to Sumerian thought. The Sumerians believed that chaos was the original state of existence, a formless and dangerous condition that preceded creation. Order was something imposed upon that chaos through divine will. Maintaining that order required constant vigilance. Any disruption, whether by humans overstepping their place or by gods defying cosmic boundaries, threatened to unravel the balance of existence. This belief shaped every aspect of Sumerian life. Kings ruled not by personal right, but by divine appointment. Laws were not human inventions, but reflections of cosmic justice. Even moral behavior was understood in terms of maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. To act unjustly was not merely to break a rule, it was to endanger the fabric of reality itself. The stories that survive from this civilization are not myths in the modern sense of fanciful tales. They are theological records, expressions of how an ancient people understood their place in an ordered universe. They explain why suffering exists, why death is unavoidable, and why humanity must live within certain limits. They explore the tension between power and restraint, ambition and consequence. Within this worldview, the Anunnaki occupy a central role. They are not benevolent guardians nor tyrannical overlords, but something more complex. They embody the principles that govern existence itself. Their judgments define fate. Their actions ripple through time. Their presence is felt even when unseen. To understand them is to understand how the earliest civilizations conceived of law, morality, and the structure of reality. These are not stories meant to comfort, but to instruct. They explain why the world is ordered as it is, why suffering exists, and why boundaries must be respected. They remind humanity that power without restraint leads to chaos, and that even the gods are bound by forces greater than themselves. This is the world into which the Anunnaki emerge, not as invaders or creators from the stars, but as integral components of a cosmic system that predates humanity itself. Their stories form the foundation upon which later myths, religions, and philosophies would build. To understand them is to step into the earliest recorded attempt to make sense of existence itself. Long before cities learned to rise from earth and brick, before kings carved their names into stone to defy time, human memory was already haunted by the presence of powers older than history itself. In the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the soil could both nourish and destroy, people came to believe that the world was governed by forces that demanded reverence, obedience, and understanding. These forces were not distant abstractions. They were intimate, immediate, and deeply involved in every breath of existence. They shaped rivers, dictated seasons, determined the fates of kings, and decided whether a harvest would feed a city or doom it to starvation. This was not a world ruled by chance. It was a world ordered by unseen authority. The people of early Mesopotamia believed that everything, from the rise of a city to the fall of a dynasty, unfolded according to a cosmic design enforced by beings older than memory itself. These beings were not imagined as gentle caretakers or moral guardians. They were powers of immense will, capable of creation and destruction with equal indifference. To understand them was to understand the structure of existence. The earliest Sumerians did not separate religion from daily life. Their gods were not confined to temples or myths. They governed agriculture, warfare, law, sexuality, birth, and death. Every action carried spiritual consequence. A failed harvest was not an accident, but a sign. A sudden illness was not chance, but judgment. Prosperity was never random. It was earned, granted, or temporarily allowed. Among these gods, some were greater than others. While countless minor deities inhabited rivers, fields, and household shrines, a higher order existed above them. These were the Anunnaki, beings whose authority extended beyond individual cities or functions. They were not merely divine patrons. They were administrators of cosmic law. Their decisions shaped destiny itself. Unlike later religious traditions that portray gods as morally perfect or omniscient, the Sumerian worldview was more complex and more unsettling. The Anunnaki were powerful, but not infallible. They could argue, disagree, and even fear consequences. They governed through consensus, judgment, and decree rather than absolute omnipotence. In their councils, fate was debated, weighed, and decided, not handed down without deliberation. This structure reflected how the Sumerians understood their own societies. Kings ruled by mandate, but they were bound by law. Councils of elders advised rulers. Authority flowed downward, but responsibility flowed upward. The divine world mirrored the human one, magnified and eternal, yet bound by similar constraints. At the heart of this system stood a central truth. Order was fragile. Chaos was not banished, it was restrained. The universe existed in a delicate balance between structure and collapse, maintained only through constant vigilance. The Anunnaki were not creators of perfection, they were guardians against dissolution. Their role was to hold reality together, to ensure that boundaries remained intact between sky and earth, life and death, order and chaos. This belief shaped how the Sumerians understood suffering. Disaster was not meaningless cruelty, but the consequence of imbalance. When boundaries were crossed, whether by humans or gods, correction followed. The world was governed by law, not sentiment. Even the highest powers were subject to it. In this worldview, humanity occupied a precarious position. Humans were neither slaves nor equals of the gods, but participants in a vast cosmic system. They were created to maintain the world through labor, ritual, and reverence. In return, they received protection, order, and continuity. Their purpose was not freedom, but function. To live well was to fulfill one's role within the greater structure. This belief shaped every aspect of early civilization. Cities were designed as reflections of cosmic order, with temples at their center acting as bridges between worlds. Priests served not merely as spiritual leaders, but as intermediaries, interpreters of divine will. Kings ruled not by personal authority, but by divine mandate, presenting themselves as stewards of cosmic law rather than its source. Within this framework, the stories of the gods were not entertainment. They were instruction. They taught people how the world worked, why suffering existed, and what boundaries must never be crossed. These stories were recited not to inspire imagination, but to preserve order. Among all these narratives, none carried more weight than those concerning the great goddess whose power transcended boundaries. She was worshipped under many names, known across regions, feared and adored in equal measure. She embodied contradiction, creation and destruction, love and violence, fertility and death. Her presence was both life-giving and terrifying. She did not rule from a distance. She descended. She crossed thresholds forbidden to others. She entered realms from which no being returned unchanged. In her descent lay the ultimate expression of divine law, that even the highest power could be stripped, judged, and broken if it defied the balance of the cosmos. Her story was not meant to comfort. It was meant to warn. For the people who told it, this was not metaphor. It was memory encoded in myth, history rendered symbolic to preserve truths too immense for ordinary language. Through her fall and return, they understood that no power stands alone, no authority is absolute, and no being, divine or mortal, exists outside the laws that govern existence itself. This was the world that gave rise to the Anunnaki, not gods of fantasy, but embodiments of order, judgment, and inevitability. They were the invisible structure beneath reality, the unseen framework holding civilization upright. And to understand them is to understand the foundation upon which the earliest human civilizations were built. As the memory of the earliest gods took form in clay and song, another truth emerged beneath the surface of Sumerian belief. The divine world was not static. It was governed by tension, hierarchy, and consequence. Power among the gods was neither equal nor absolute. It shifted, fractured, and reassembled according to laws older than any temple or throne. To understand this, one must look beyond the grandeur of creation myths and examine the structure that held divine society together. At the center of this structure stood the Anunnaki, not as creators of existence, but as administrators of its balance. Their authority was not inherited through birth alone, nor granted through conquest, but earned through function. Each held responsibility over a domain that sustained order in the cosmos. Some governed the movement of celestial bodies, others the fertility of the land, the passage of time, or the fate of the dead. Together, they formed a system of governance that mirrored the bureaucratic societies of early Mesopotamia. This resemblance was not coincidence. The Sumerians understood their world through analogy. Just as cities required administrators, scribes, judges, and laborers, so too did the universe require hierarchy. The Anunnaki embodied this principle. They were not distant abstractions, but living embodiments of law and structure. Their power was immense, yet never arbitrary. Every act had precedent. Every decision required consensus or decree. Among them, a smaller group held particular authority in matters of judgment. These were the divine arbiters, summoned when balance was threatened. Their role was not to create or destroy, but to decide. In mythic narratives, when a boundary was crossed or a taboo violated, it was these figures who convened to determine the consequences. Their judgments carried the weight of inevitability. Once spoken, they could not be undone. This concept of cosmic judgment shaped how the Sumerians understood justice on Earth. Courts, laws, and punishments were not human inventions, but reflections of divine order. Kings did not rule by personal strength alone. They ruled because the gods had sanctioned their authority. When a ruler failed, it was not merely political failure, but a cosmic imbalance. Famine, plague, and invasion were interpreted as signs that divine order had been disrupted. The Anunnaki were therefore not moral exemplars, but enforcers of equilibrium. They did not reward virtue for its own sake, nor punish evil out of spite. They acted to preserve stability. In this sense, morality was secondary to order. A deed was judged not by intention, but by its impact on cosmic balance. This worldview is most vividly expressed in the myths surrounding divine transgression. When a god overstepped, consequences followed without exception. Power did not grant immunity. In fact, the greater the power, the greater the consequence. This principle appears repeatedly in stories of gods who challenged boundaries, those who sought to rule beyond their domain or disrupt the balance between realms. One such narrative recounts the descent of a powerful goddess into the realm of death. Her journey was not framed as an act of heroism or rebellion, but as a violation of cosmic law. The underworld was not merely another territory. It was a closed system governed by its own immutable rules. Entry required submission, and exit was never guaranteed. By crossing that threshold, she challenged the very structure that kept existence ordered. Her punishment was severe not because of malice, but because balance demanded it. Stripped of her symbols of power, she was reduced to vulnerability, subject to the same fate as mortals. Her descent illustrated a fundamental truth of Sumerian belief. No being, however powerful, stood above the laws that governed the universe. The reaction of the other gods to her fate reveals the complexity of their world. Some feared the consequences of her absence, recognizing her essential role in sustaining life and fertility. Others upheld the necessity of punishment, arguing that order must be preserved at any cost. The debates reflect a cosmic legal system, one in which emotion and logic coexist but never override structure. This tension between compassion and law is central to understanding the Anunnaki. They were not villains or heroes, but custodians of balance. Their decisions often produced suffering, yet they were bound to uphold the framework that made existence possible. To violate that framework was to risk chaos, dissolution, and the collapse of reality itself. The Sumerians understood this tension intimately. Their lives were shaped by unpredictable floods, droughts, and invasions. Survival depended on respecting forces beyond human control. The gods embodied those forces, and the stories told about them served as lessons in humility and restraint. In this worldview, rebellion against divine order was not an act of liberation, but of self-destruction. When gods or humans attempted to exceed their assigned roles, the result was catastrophe. This theme recurs throughout Mesopotamian literature. Ambition leads to downfall, excess invites correction, and balance must always be restored. Yet within this rigid structure existed moments of mercy and negotiation. The gods were not blind to suffering. They could be moved by loyalty, devotion, and sacrifice. Intercession was possible, but it required adherence to ritual and respect for cosmic law. Compassion was permitted, but never at the expense of order. This duality defined the relationship between the divine and the mortal. Humans were small, fragile, and transient, yet their actions mattered. Their prayers could influence outcomes. Their devotion could sway judgment. They were participants in a cosmic system, not passive subjects. The Anunnaki, then, were not distant tyrants, but the embodiment of an ordered universe, one that demanded responsibility, humility, and reverence. Their stories served as both explanation and warning, teaching that existence itself was governed by laws older and stronger than any individual will. Through these narratives, the Sumerians articulated a worldview in which meaning arose not from domination, but from balance. The gods were powerful, but bound. Humanity was fragile, but significant. Together they formed a cosmos governed not by chaos, but by an intricate and unforgiving order that shaped every aspect of life. This understanding laid the foundation for all that followed. It influenced how later cultures conceived of law, morality, and the divine. The echoes of these ancient ideas would resonate through millennia, shaping religions, philosophies, and civilizations long after the names of the Anunnaki faded from common memory. Yet their legacy endured, embedded in the very structure of how humanity came to understand power, justice, and the nature of existence itself. As the divine order solidified and the roles of gods became fixed within the cosmic structure, humanity found itself living beneath an immense and unyielding hierarchy. The universe, as understood by the Sumerians, was not an abstract moral system, but a living mechanism, governed by forces that demanded constant acknowledgement. Every harvest, every storm, every birth and death unfolded within a framework maintained by beings far beyond human reach. To exist was to participate in a vast system of obligation, one in which balance was not guaranteed, but continuously negotiated. The Anunnaki stood at the center of this structure, but they did not operate in isolation. Around them existed a vast network of lesser deities, spirits, and intermediaries, each responsible for a specific function within the cosmic order. Rivers had guardians, fields had patrons, cities were bound to divine protectors, whose favor determined prosperity or ruin. Nothing was without oversight, and nothing occurred by chance. Even misfortune had a reason, even suffering a cause. Human beings were not created for companionship or affection. They were brought into existence to serve a function within this immense system. Their labor sustained the temples, and their rituals sustained the gods. In return, the gods maintained order, fertility, and continuity. This relationship was transactional, but not without complexity. While humans depended on divine favor, the gods in turn depended on human devotion. Without offerings, without prayers, without rituals, the divine realm weakened. The relationship was reciprocal, though never equal. This interdependence shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian life. Kings ruled not by personal strength alone, but as representatives of divine will. Their authority was validated through ritual, omens, and signs believed to reflect the gods' approval. When a king failed, when crops failed, when enemies invaded, when disease spread, it was interpreted as evidence that divine favor had been withdrawn. The king had failed in his duty to maintain harmony between the earthly and the divine. In this context, law was not merely a social construct, but a sacred expression of cosmic order. Legal codes were believed to reflect divine principles, handed down through inspiration or revelation. To violate the law was not only to harm another person, but to disrupt the balance of the universe. Justice, therefore, was sacred. Punishment was not revenge, but restoration of order. This worldview shaped the way the Sumerians understood suffering. Misfortune was rarely seen as random. It was a message, a correction, or a consequence. Even when suffering seemed undeserved, it was assumed to serve a purpose within a larger, unseen structure. This belief offered explanation, if not comfort. It transformed chaos into meaning. Within this framework, the Anunnaki functioned as the ultimate arbiters. They were not compassionate in a human sense, nor were they cruel for its own sake. Their judgments were impersonal, rooted in the maintenance of balance. Mercy existed, but only within strict boundaries. Transgression carried consequences, and those consequences were often severe. One of the most profound aspects of this worldview is the way it confronted the inevitability of death. Death was not viewed as a punishment, but as an essential component of cosmic order. Mortality defined the boundary between humans and gods. Attempts to cross that boundary, to escape death or claim immortality, were seen as violations of the natural order, often met with severe repercussions. The stories preserved in clay tablets repeatedly return to this theme. Mortals who sought eternal life were denied. Gods who overstepped their domain were punished. The universe functioned through balance, not exception. Immortality was reserved for the divine, and even they were subject to law. This understanding shaped the Sumerian view of the afterlife. Unlike later religious traditions that envisioned reward or punishment beyond death, the Sumerian afterlife was bleak and shadowed. All who died, regardless of status or virtue, descended to the same realm. There was no moral judgment, no reward for righteousness. The afterlife was a continuation of existence in diminished form, stripped of joy and vitality. This bleak vision reinforced the importance of life on earth. Meaning was found not in hope for an afterlife, but in fulfilling one's role while alive. Honor, legacy, and remembrance mattered more than salvation. To be remembered was to endure. To be forgotten was to vanish completely. In this context, the stories of gods descending into the underworld took on profound significance. When a deity entered the realm of death, it was not a symbolic journey, but a literal violation of cosmic boundaries. Such acts threatened the stability of the universe itself. The consequences of these transgressions were severe, not because the gods were cruel, but because the structure of existence demanded balance. The Anunnaki served as guardians of that balance. They were not compassionate overseers, but enforcers of necessity. Their judgments were final, their decrees irreversible. Through them, the universe maintained coherence. Without them, chaos would reign. Yet even within this rigid system, there was space for negotiation, cunning, and adaptation. The gods themselves were not immune to persuasion. Cleverness could alter fate where strength could not. This belief reflected a deep understanding of power as something flexible, responsive, and deeply intertwined with knowledge. Wisdom in this world was more valuable than force. Those who understood the rules could navigate them. Those who ignored them were destroyed. This principle applied equally to gods and humans. Knowledge was the true source of power. This worldview produced a civilization deeply attuned to patterns, cycles, and repetition. Time was not linear, but cyclical. History repeated itself. Events echoed previous events. The past was not distant. It was present in every ritual, every law, every story told by firelight or carved into clay. Through these stories, the Sumerians preserved their understanding of existence. They encoded their philosophy into myth, their theology into narrative, their laws into legend. The Anunnaki were not merely characters in these stories. They were the embodiment of a worldview that sought to explain why the world was as it was, and why humans occupied the fragile place they did within it. In this way, the myths were not escapism, but instruction. They taught caution, humility, and reverence. They warned against excess and pride. They reminded humanity of its limits and its responsibilities. Above all, they affirmed that existence itself was governed by order, and that to live well was to live in harmony with that order. This understanding formed the foundation upon which later civilizations would build. Though names would change and beliefs would evolve, the core idea that the universe is structured, meaningful, and governed by laws beyond human control would endure. The legacy of the Anunnaki was not merely mythological, it was philosophical, shaping how humanity came to understand power, justice, and its own place within the cosmos. As the structure of divine authority solidified, the world of the gods grew increasingly complex, layered with hierarchy, duty, and consequence. The Anunnaki did not exist in isolation. They functioned within an intricate system of divine relationships that mirrored the political and social realities of early Mesopotamian civilization. Power was distributed, delegated, and contested. Authority was not absolute, but conditional, shaped by responsibility and maintained through balance. At the heart of this system stood the idea that order was fragile. It could not sustain itself without constant maintenance. The gods themselves were responsible for preserving equilibrium, and failure to do so carried grave consequences. This belief infused every aspect of myth and ritual, reinforcing the notion that chaos was always waiting to return if vigilance lapsed. The divine hierarchy reflected this anxiety. Above all stood the highest gods, embodiments of cosmic principles rather than individual personalities. Beneath them were lesser deities assigned specific roles: guardians of rivers, winds, fertility, justice, and death. These gods were not symbolic abstractions, but active agents whose decisions shaped reality. Their domains overlapped, occasionally clashed, and required negotiation to maintain harmony. The Anunnaki occupied a central place within this system. They were not creators in the absolute sense, nor were they passive observers. They were administrators, enforcers, and arbiters. Their authority derived from ancient precedents rather than brute strength. They represented continuity, an unbroken chain linking the primordial past to the present moment. This conception of divine authority mirrored the political structure of early city-states. Kings ruled by mandate, not by divine identity. They were chosen, supported, and constrained by religious institutions. A king who failed to uphold justice risked losing divine favor, which could manifest as famine, invasion, or internal collapse. In this way, cosmic order and political order were inseparable. The myths that preserved these ideas were not written for entertainment. They were instructional, serving as frameworks for understanding power, obligation, and consequence. They explained why suffering existed and why obedience mattered. They justified hierarchy not as tyranny, but as necessity. Through myth, society explained itself to itself. One of the most striking aspects of this worldview was its acceptance of limitation. Even the gods were not free from constraint. They operated within a cosmic structure that predated them and would outlast them. Their power was immense, but not infinite. They could shape events but not rewrite the fundamental rules of existence. This belief is evident in the recurring theme of divine assemblies, councils in which decisions were debated rather than dictated. These gatherings reflected the belief that authority required consensus. No single god could act alone without consequences. Even the most powerful deities were bound by the collective will of the divine order. Such stories reveal a sophisticated understanding of power as something inherently relational. Authority was not an inherent trait, but a function of balance, agreement, and responsibility. This perspective contrasts sharply with later portrayals of omnipotent deities and highlights the uniquely pragmatic worldview of early Mesopotamian thought. The gods themselves were subject to fate, a concept often personified but ultimately impersonal. Fate was not a being to be worshipped, but a force that governed even the divine. This idea underscored the limits of power and the inevitability of consequence. It reinforced the belief that no being, however mighty, could escape the structure of the cosmos. Within this framework, transgression was not merely immoral, it was destabilizing. To act against cosmic order was to invite disaster, not just for oneself, but for the entire system. This belief permeated every level of society, reinforcing conformity and discouraging hubris. Yet within this rigidity existed a profound sense of tragedy. The gods, though powerful, were bound to roles they did not choose. They could suffer, regret, and fear the outcomes of their own actions. Their stories were filled with conflict, not because of moral failing, but because existence itself demanded struggle. This tragic dimension gave depth to the divine narratives. The gods were not distant ideals, but beings caught in the same web of cause and effect that ensnared humanity. Their suffering mirrored human suffering on a grander scale, lending cosmic significance to human experience. In this light, the myths functioned as a form of existential reflection. They addressed questions that remained unanswered by ritual or law. Why does suffering exist? Why must order be maintained at such cost? Why is harmony so fragile? The answers offered were not comforting, but they were coherent. They portrayed a universe governed by necessity rather than benevolence. This worldview fostered a sense of responsibility rather than hope. Humans were not promised salvation or eternal reward. Instead, they were expected to fulfill their role within the greater system, to maintain balance through obedience, labor, and ritual. Meaning was found not in escape from the world, but in participation within it. The Anunnaki, as embodiments of this system, were neither heroes nor villains. They were functionaries of cosmic law, enforcers of order, and custodians of balance. Their stories were cautionary, illustrating the consequences of excess, defiance, and imbalance. Through these narratives, the Sumerians articulated a vision of existence that was both sobering and profound. It acknowledged the harshness of reality without denying its structure. It recognized suffering without reducing it to chaos. It affirmed that even in a universe governed by impersonal forces, meaning could be found through understanding one's place within the whole. This perspective would echo through later cultures, influencing how humanity understood divinity, authority, and responsibility. The echoes of these ancient ideas can still be heard in modern concepts of law, governance, and moral order. Though the names of the gods have changed, the questions they confronted remain. In the end, the Anunnaki were not merely gods of a forgotten age. They were symbols of humanity's earliest attempt to comprehend the invisible forces shaping existence. Through them, ancient people articulated a vision of the cosmos that was structured, demanding, and profoundly interconnected. A vision that continues to resonate long after the temples have turned to dust. As the structure of divine authority solidified, and the cosmic order became fixed within the imagination of early Mesopotamian civilization, the relationship between humans and gods took on a distinctly transactional form. Existence was understood not as a passive state, but as a continuous exchange. Life demanded maintenance, attention, and constant reaffirmation of balance. The universe did not run on goodwill or moral intention alone. It functioned through ritual precision, observance, and repetition. Every action carried weight. Every omission risked consequence. Within this worldview, ritual was not symbolic performance, but a functional necessity. Offerings were not gestures of devotion in a modern sense. They were acts of maintenance as essential as irrigation or construction. The gods required nourishment, acknowledgement, and respect to sustain the cosmic equilibrium. Sacrifice was not seen as loss, but as participation in an eternal cycle of exchange. What humans offered, the gods returned in stability, fertility, and protection. Temples stood at the center of this relationship. They were not simply houses of worship, but living institutions that bridged the divine and human realms. Built at the heart of cities, often atop massive platforms, they symbolized the axis between heaven and earth. Within their walls, priests acted as intermediaries, performing rituals that aligned human activity with divine will. These rituals followed precise formulas passed down through generations, believed to mirror the patterns that governed the cosmos itself. The daily rhythm of temple life was meticulous. Offerings of bread, beer, grain, and livestock were prepared according to strict standards. Incantations were recited with exact pronunciation, for a mispronounced word could alter the intended effect. Timing was critical. Certain rites could only be performed at specific hours during particular phases of the moon or seasons of the year. The universe was thought to operate on a schedule, and ritual aligned human action with that cosmic rhythm. This ritual discipline extended beyond the temple into every aspect of life. Agriculture followed sacred calendars. Legal decisions were preceded by divination. Even warfare was conducted according to omens and divine approval. Nothing of significance occurred without consulting the unseen forces believed to govern outcomes. At the center of these practices was the belief that the gods communicated through signs, dreams, omens, celestial movements, and anomalies in nature were interpreted as messages. The role of the priest was not to command the gods, but to listen, to interpret signs and discern intention. Divination was therefore not superstition, but a system of knowledge, a method for decoding the will of the divine. Among the many forms of divination practiced, some were highly elaborate. The examination of animal entrails, especially the liver, was considered a direct window into divine intention. The liver was viewed as the seat of life and consciousness, a microcosm of the universe itself. By studying its markings, priests believed they could read the intentions of the gods with remarkable precision. These practices were not random. They followed extensive manuals developed over centuries of observation and interpretation. Such methods reflect a worldview in which the universe was legible, structured, and responsive. Nothing was arbitrary. Every sign had meaning, every event a cause. This belief fostered a profound sense of order, but also a deep anxiety. If the gods communicated through signs, then misinterpretation could lead to catastrophe. Precision was not optional. It was essential for survival. Within this framework, human beings were both empowered and constrained. They possessed the capacity to influence outcomes through correct action, yet they remained subject to forces beyond their control. This tension defined the human condition as understood by the Sumerians. Freedom existed, but only within limits. Knowledge offered guidance, but never certainty. The gods themselves were bound by similar constraints. They could not act arbitrarily without consequence. Their decisions affected the balance of the cosmos and often required consensus among the divine assembly. This mutual dependence created a system of checks and balances that mirrored human governance. Power was distributed, negotiated, and justified through precedent. This conception of the universe left little room for randomness. Events were meaningful even when their meaning was obscure. Suffering was not meaningless, though its reasons might remain hidden. Misfortune demanded interpretation rather than denial. In this way, the Sumerians sought to impose intelligibility on a world that often seemed indifferent or hostile. The weight of this worldview shaped personal identity. Individuals were not defined by inner beliefs or personal freedom, but by their place within a larger order. One's role in family, city, and cosmos determined purpose and value. To live well was to fulfill one's assigned function with diligence and reverence. This perspective fostered a deep sense of continuity. The present was inseparable from the past, and the future was bound to both. Ancestral memory, ritual repetition, and adherence to tradition created a sense of permanence in an unpredictable world. The past was not distant. It was alive in ritual and story. At the heart of this system lay the conviction that chaos was always near. Floods, droughts, disease, and invasion were constant threats. The gods themselves had once unleashed destruction upon the world, and they could do so again. Only vigilance and reverence stood between order and collapse. Thus, the Anunnaki were not merely figures of myth, but embodiments of a cosmic system that demanded participation. To live was to engage in a continuous act of balance. To neglect one's duties was to risk unraveling the fragile harmony that sustained existence. This worldview did not promise salvation or transcendence. It offered stability through obedience and meaning through alignment with cosmic law. It was a vision grounded not in hope for a better world beyond, but in the disciplined maintenance of the one that existed. Through this lens, the myths of the Anunnaki become more than stories. They are expressions of a profound philosophical understanding that order is not given freely, that power carries obligation, and that survival depends on respecting the unseen structures that govern all things. In this ancient worldview, humanity was neither master nor victim, but participant. Bound by law, sustained by ritual, and watched over by forces older than memory, human life unfolded within a cosmos that demanded reverence, awareness, and restraint. The Anunnaki, as guardians of this order, stood as eternal reminders that existence itself was a responsibility, one that could never be taken lightly. As centuries passed, and cities rose and fell along the rivers of Mesopotamia, the understanding of the gods evolved, but the structure of belief remained unbroken. The Anunnaki were no longer merely distant presences. They became woven into the rhythms of daily life, their influence felt in every decision, every ritual, every act of governance. Their authority was not abstract. It was enacted through systems, reinforced through tradition, and internalized by those who lived beneath their watchful order. The people of the land did not imagine the gods as unreachable beings dwelling in distant heavens. Instead, the divine was thought to exist in constant proximity, inhabiting temples, statues, and sacred spaces. The gods were believed to reside physically within their cult images, animated through ritual and sustained through offerings. When a statue was carved and consecrated, it was not considered a representation, but a dwelling. The god was thought to enter it, making the divine tangibly present among the people. This belief transformed architecture into theology. Temples were not symbolic structures, but living centers of divine presence. Every brick laid was an act of devotion. Every column, courtyard, and altar reflected cosmic order. The layout of sacred complexes mirrored the structure of the universe as it was understood: heaven above, earth below, and the temple as the meeting point between the two. The daily operation of these sacred spaces required an intricate hierarchy of priests, scribes, musicians, and attendants. Each role carried specific responsibilities, and each task had to be performed with precision. Ritual error was dangerous, not merely disrespectful. A mistake in a chant or offering could disrupt the harmony between worlds, inviting misfortune. The gods, though powerful, were believed to rely on human participation to sustain their presence. Offerings fed them, hymns strengthened them, and rituals renewed their connection to the world. This mutual dependency created a relationship not of domination, but of interdependence. The gods needed humanity as much as humanity needed the gods. This concept extended to the divine assembly itself. The Anunnaki were not solitary rulers, but members of a structured order. Decisions were made collectively. Authority flowed through councils. Even the highest gods were bound by custom and precedent. No single deity, no matter how powerful, could act entirely alone without disrupting the balance that sustained the cosmos. This idea of shared governance reflected the political realities of early city-states, where councils of elders and assemblies of elites often guided decisions alongside kings. The divine realm mirrored human governance, reinforcing the belief that order in one reflected order in the other. The universe was a vast polity, governed by law rather than whim. Within this framework, the concept of justice took on a profound cosmic dimension. Justice was not merely about fairness between individuals, it was about maintaining balance between forces. When injustice occurred, it was not simply a moral failing, but a disturbance in the fabric of reality. Such imbalance demanded correction, sometimes through suffering, sometimes through sacrifice. The Anunnaki, as arbiters of this balance, embodied justice not as compassion, but as necessity. They were not moved by pity, but by principle. Their judgments could be harsh, yet they were considered essential to the preservation of order. This understanding shaped how people interpreted misfortune. Disaster was not random. It was a signal that balance had been disrupted. In this worldview, human suffering was not meaningless, but neither was it redemptive in a moral sense. Suffering was a symptom of imbalance, a sign that something in the cosmic structure required correction. It demanded response, not resignation. Ritual, repentance, and restoration were the means through which balance could be restored. The gods themselves were subject to this system. They could suffer consequences for their actions, lose status, or be confined to specific realms. Divine power did not grant immunity from cosmic law. Instead, it imposed greater responsibility. The higher the position, the greater the obligation to uphold order. This idea is reflected in the myths describing conflicts among the gods. These stories do not depict chaos for its own sake, but rather moments when equilibrium is threatened and must be restored. Each conflict serves as a lesson in the dangers of excess, pride, or neglect. The resolution of these conflicts reinforces the importance of balance as the guiding principle of existence. The human role within this cosmic order was not passive. Through ritual, obedience, and devotion, humans participated in maintaining balance. Their actions mattered. Their choices had consequences that extended beyond the individual to the community and even to the divine realm. This belief fostered a sense of responsibility that permeated every aspect of life. Time itself was perceived through this lens. It was cyclical rather than linear, marked by recurring patterns of decay and renewal. Festivals reenacted creation, reaffirming the stability of the cosmos. Through repetition, the world was renewed, and chaos was held at bay. Each ritual reenactment reinforced the cosmic order, ensuring its continuity. The Anunnaki, as guardians of this system, embodied the permanence of these cycles. They were not static figures frozen in myth, but active participants in the ongoing maintenance of reality. Their stories conveyed lessons about restraint, duty, and the consequences of imbalance. Through them, the ancient world articulated a philosophy of existence rooted in order, responsibility, and interconnectedness. In this vision, the universe was not a place of random chance, but a carefully regulated system sustained by law and ritual. The divine was not distant or arbitrary, but intimately involved in the rhythms of life. Humanity's role was not to conquer or escape this system, but to live in harmony with it. Thus, the Anunnaki were not merely gods to be worshipped, but principles to be understood. They represented the forces that governed existence itself. Through them, early civilizations articulated a worldview that sought meaning in structure, purpose in duty, and stability in balance. Their legacy endures not as myth alone, but as a foundational expression of how humans first sought to understand their place in the cosmos. As centuries passed and civilizations rose upon the bones of their predecessors, the image of the Anunnaki evolved alongside human understanding, yet their essential function remained unchanged. They continued to embody the invisible architecture of existence, the unseen mechanisms that governed fate, order, and continuity. Even as cities fell and languages shifted, the fundamental idea persisted. The universe was not random. It was governed by forces that demanded recognition, discipline, and respect. The expansion of city-states and the growth of empires brought new layers to this worldview. As political power centralized, so too did divine authority. Kings no longer ruled merely as representatives of a local deity. They began to present themselves as chosen instruments of a universal order. The Anunnaki, once perceived primarily as localized powers, were increasingly understood as universal regulators whose influence extended across lands and peoples. This shift mirrored the transformation of human governance from fragmented communities into centralized states. With this transformation came a deeper emphasis on law. Law was no longer a human construct alone, but a reflection of cosmic order. Legal codes were framed not as inventions, but as revelations. They were believed to originate from divine authority, transmitted through kings who served as intermediaries between heaven and earth. To obey the law was to align oneself with the structure of the universe. To break it was to invite chaos. This idea is preserved in the great legal traditions that emerged from Mesopotamia, where justice was depicted not as mercy, but as balance. Crimes disrupted harmony, and punishment restored it. The gods were thought to oversee this process, ensuring that no violation went unanswered. In this sense, law became a sacred mechanism, a tool for maintaining equilibrium rather than expressing moral compassion. As societies grew more complex, so too did their understanding of fate. Fate was not a fixed destiny imposed at birth, but a dynamic force shaped by action and divine will. Humans could influence their fate through obedience, ritual, and wisdom, but they could not escape the boundaries imposed by the cosmic order. This tension between agency and limitation defined the human condition. Within this framework, prophecy emerged as a means of navigating uncertainty. Prophets and diviners did not predict the future in a deterministic sense. Rather, they interpreted signs to assess the current alignment of forces. Their role was diagnostic, not predictive. They read the symptoms of imbalance and offered guidance on how to restore harmony. Their authority lay not in foresight, but in interpretation. The gods themselves were bound by this same structure. They were not omniscient arbiters existing outside time. They operated within it, responding to shifts in balance and adjusting their actions accordingly. This dynamic understanding of divinity made the universe feel alive, responsive, and relational. The divine was not distant. It was engaged in an ongoing dialogue with creation. One of the most profound implications of this worldview was the idea that suffering had meaning beyond punishment. Misfortune was not simply a sign of divine displeasure, but an indication that equilibrium had been disrupted. Restoration, rather than retribution, became the ultimate goal. Rituals of atonement, purification, and renewal were designed to restore harmony rather than merely appease anger. This perspective allowed for a nuanced understanding of guilt and responsibility. Individuals were not inherently sinful, but capable of error. Redemption was possible through acknowledgement, correction, and realignment with cosmic order. In this sense, morality was practical rather than moralistic. It focused on restoring balance rather than assigning blame. The gods themselves embodied this principle. They were not static moral ideals, but dynamic forces navigating a complex universe. Their conflicts, alliances, and transformations reflected the ever-shifting nature of existence. Through their stories, the Sumerians explored the tensions between order and chaos, freedom and constraint, power and responsibility. As these narratives evolved, they shaped the worldview of neighboring cultures. The concepts of divine law, cosmic balance, and ordained order influenced later civilizations, leaving traces in their myths, laws, and philosophies. Though names and symbols changed, the underlying ideas endured. The Anunnaki, in this broader context, were not merely ancient deities, but conceptual frameworks for understanding existence. They represented humanity's earliest attempt to articulate the principles governing reality. Their stories encoded observations about nature, society, and human behavior into enduring symbolic form. Through these narratives, early civilizations confronted fundamental questions. Why does order exist? Why does it fail? What role do humans play in maintaining it? The answers they developed were not abstract theories, but lived truths, reinforced through ritual and tradition. In this way, mythology functioned as both explanation and instruction. It provided a map for navigating an unpredictable world, offering guidance on how to live within its constraints. The Anunnaki were not distant gods to be feared or worshipped blindly. They were expressions of the rules by which existence operated. As time passed and cultures evolved, the original meanings of these stories became layered with interpretation. Later generations reimagined the gods, reinterpreted their actions, and adapted their roles to new contexts. Yet beneath these transformations, the core ideas remained remarkably consistent. The enduring power of these myths lies in their ability to speak to fundamental human concerns: order and chaos, duty and freedom, power and responsibility. They reflect a deep awareness that life operates within limits, and that harmony requires respect for forces beyond individual control. Even as modern perspectives move away from mythological explanations, the underlying questions persist. How should power be exercised? What responsibilities accompany authority? How does one live within a system larger than oneself? These questions, first articulated through the language of gods and rituals, continue to shape human thought. The Anunnaki, in this sense, are not relics of a forgotten past, but expressions of enduring human inquiry. They represent the earliest attempt to understand the structure of reality and humanity's place within it. Their legacy is not confined to ancient tablets, but lives on in the ideas that continue to shape civilization. Through their stories, we glimpse the origins of law, morality, and cosmic order. We see how early humans grappled with forces beyond their control and sought meaning within a vast, often indifferent universe. In doing so, they laid the foundations for systems of thought that still influence the world today. Thus, the Anunnaki remain relevant not because they were gods in a literal sense, but because they embodied humanity's first serious attempt to comprehend existence itself. They stand as symbols of an enduring quest for order in a universe defined by change, a quest that continues in different forms to this very day. As centuries unfolded and civilizations layered themselves atop the remnants of earlier worlds, the legacy of the Anunnaki did not fade. It transformed. Their presence became less overt, less bound to temple rituals and divine assemblies, yet more deeply embedded within the structures of thought that governed human civilization. What began as direct worship evolved into ideology, law, and inherited worldview. The gods no longer needed to appear. Their logic had been absorbed into the very framework of society. This transformation marked a critical shift in human consciousness. The divine order, once external and visible, became internalized. People no longer experienced the gods as figures who walked among them, but as principles shaping the invisible architecture of existence. Authority, hierarchy, obligation, and cosmic justice were no longer enforced by immediate divine intervention, but by systems that mirrored divine structure. In this way, the Anunnaki never truly vanished. They became abstracted, embedded within institutions, traditions, and cultural memory. The notion of divine law evolved into codified law. What had once been spoken by priests on behalf of gods was now inscribed on stone stelae and enforced by kings. These laws still carried sacred weight, believed to originate from higher powers, even if the gods themselves were no longer visibly present. Justice became less about appeasing divine anger and more about maintaining societal equilibrium. Yet the underlying principle remained unchanged. Order must be preserved. This transformation can be seen in the emergence of legal systems that claimed divine origin while functioning through human administration. The famous legal codes of Mesopotamia did not present themselves as inventions of human reason, but as revelations granted by the gods. Kings portrayed themselves not as authors of law, but as its custodians. In doing so, they preserved the ancient belief that authority flowed from a higher, unseen source. As religious thought matured, the gods themselves became more abstract. Their anthropomorphic qualities softened, their personalities less vivid. What remained were their functions, the roles they played in maintaining cosmic and social order. The Anunnaki became less like individuals and more like principles: justice, fate, authority, continuity. Their stories were no longer merely tales of divine drama, but symbolic frameworks through which people understood existence. This abstraction did not weaken belief, it refined it. The divine became less about spectacle and more about structure. Rather than intervening directly, the gods operated through laws, institutions, and moral expectations. Their presence was felt not in miracles, but in stability. The world worked because the divine order was upheld. As societies grew more complex, this conceptual shift allowed religious thought to adapt without collapsing. The gods could evolve alongside culture, their forms changing while their functions remained intact. In this way, the Anunnaki became archetypes, patterns of authority, justice, and power that transcended specific myths. These archetypes found expression in later philosophies and religions. Concepts of divine law, moral accountability, and cosmic order persisted, even as names and narratives changed. The idea that existence is governed by an intelligible structure, one that humans can understand but not control, remained central. It shaped ethical systems, political theories, and spiritual beliefs for millennia. The endurance of these ideas suggests that they addressed fundamental human concerns. People sought meaning in a world that often appeared chaotic and unjust. By framing existence as governed by higher principles, early civilizations found coherence amid uncertainty. The Anunnaki, as embodiments of those principles, provided a language through which humanity could interpret its experience. This interpretive framework offered both comfort and constraint. It reassured people that their lives had purpose, but it also imposed limits on ambition and desire. The gods were not benevolent caretakers who guaranteed happiness. They were custodians of order who demanded adherence. Human freedom existed, but only within prescribed boundaries. Over time, this worldview influenced emerging philosophical traditions. Concepts of natural law, moral order, and cosmic harmony all trace their lineage to these early mythological systems. Even when stripped of mythic imagery, the underlying assumptions persisted. The idea that the universe operates according to discernible principles, that actions have consequences beyond immediate perception, and that balance is essential for stability, all echo the ancient worldview shaped by the Anunnaki. As cultures evolved and religious thought became more abstract, the stories of the gods were reinterpreted rather than discarded. They became allegories, symbols, and metaphors through which deeper truths were explored. The literal presence of gods faded, but their functions endured within philosophical and ethical frameworks. This transformation reflects a broader human tendency to preserve meaning even as forms change. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia may no longer be worshipped, but the ideas they represented continue to influence modern thought. Concepts of justice, order, responsibility, and consequence remain central to human society. In this sense, the Anunnaki never truly disappeared. They were absorbed into the foundations of culture, becoming invisible architects of human understanding. Their legacy persists not in temples or rituals, but in the structures that govern human behavior and thought. Through this lens, ancient myth becomes more than story. It becomes a record of humanity's earliest attempt to articulate its place in the universe. The Anunnaki symbolize humanity's recognition that existence is governed by forces beyond individual control, yet not beyond comprehension. They represent the enduring human effort to impose meaning on a complex and often indifferent cosmos. By examining these ancient narratives, we gain insight not only into the beliefs of long-lost civilizations, but into the enduring patterns of human thought. The questions they asked about power, order, and purpose are the same questions that continue to shape our world today. Thus, the legacy of the Anunnaki is not confined to the distant past. It lives on in the structures of governance, the pursuit of justice, and the human search for meaning. Their story is not merely a myth of ancient gods, but a reflection of humanity's enduring attempt to understand the forces that shape existence itself. As the ancient world moved forward through centuries of upheaval and renewal, the legacy of the Anunnaki continued to shape the invisible framework of human civilization. Their presence no longer required temples of stone or rituals of blood and incense to be felt. Instead, their influence persisted through ideas, through inherited assumptions about power, order, obligation, and the structure of reality itself. What had once been expressed through myth and ritual gradually transformed into philosophy, governance, and moral law. The shift did not erase the divine framework, it refined it. As societies grew more complex, they required systems capable of managing larger populations and more intricate relationships. The divine order that once manifested through ritual performance began to express itself through institutions. Law codes, bureaucracies, and social hierarchies emerged as secular reflections of cosmic order. The universe, once interpreted through mythic narrative, was now mirrored in human systems of governance. This transition did not represent a rejection of the sacred, but its internalization. Where once the gods were seen acting directly in the world, now their will was believed to operate through established structures. Justice was no longer administered by divine intervention, but by courts and laws believed to reflect divine principles. Authority was no longer wielded by priests alone, but by kings and officials who claimed legitimacy through divine sanction. In this evolving worldview, the divine became less personal and more abstract. The Anunnaki were no longer envisioned as figures who walked among humanity, but as forces embedded in the fabric of existence. Their presence was inferred rather than observed, discerned through patterns rather than encounters. This shift allowed belief to persist, even as literal faith waned. Yet the fundamental idea remained unchanged. Order is not accidental. It must be maintained, defended, and respected. Chaos is not evil in itself, but it is dangerous when uncontained. The role of civilization, therefore, was to impose structure upon chaos, just as the gods had done at the dawn of creation. This perspective deeply influenced the development of law and morality. Justice was not simply a social contract, but an expression of cosmic balance. Wrongdoing disrupted harmony and required correction, not out of vengeance, but necessity. Punishment restored equilibrium. Mercy, when extended, was not arbitrary but measured, ensuring that balance remained intact. Over time, these principles became embedded in cultural memory. Even as belief in specific deities faded, the underlying framework endured. Societies continued to operate under the assumption that order must be preserved, that actions carry consequences, and that authority derives from alignment with a greater structure. The Anunnaki, once imagined as living beings who convened in divine assemblies, gradually transformed into archetypes, representations of universal forces that shape existence. They became symbols rather than personalities, their stories serving as metaphors for the human condition. This transformation did not diminish their significance, it expanded it. As symbols, they transcended time and place. They could be reinterpreted, reimagined, and integrated into new belief systems. Their essence persisted even as their forms changed. In philosophical traditions, the idea of a rational, ordered universe governed by intelligible principles echoed the ancient belief in cosmic law. In legal systems, the concept of justice as an objective standard reflected the old notion of divine judgment. In ethical thought, the emphasis on balance, responsibility, and consequence mirrored the moral structure once attributed to the gods. Thus, the legacy of the Anunnaki extended far beyond their mythological origins. They became part of humanity's intellectual inheritance, shaping how people understood power, morality, and their place in the cosmos. Their influence could be felt in the foundations of law, religion, and philosophy across cultures and eras. This continuity suggests that the ancient stories were not mere fantasies, but expressions of deep human intuitions about order and meaning. They offered a way to comprehend the complexity of existence, to find coherence in a world that often appeared chaotic and unjust. Even as scientific understanding expanded and the cosmos came to be seen through empirical lenses, the underlying questions remained the same. What governs the universe? What is the source of order? What responsibilities accompany power? The answers changed, but the questions endured. In this sense, the Anunnaki can be understood as early attempts to articulate principles that remain central to human thought. They represent an early effort to systematize experience, to explain why the world functions as it does, and to establish a framework within which human life could find meaning. Their legacy is not found in ruins or relics alone, but in the continuing human pursuit of order amid chaos. It lives on in the laws we create, the institutions we build, and the moral codes we uphold. It persists in the belief that the universe is governed by structure, that actions have consequences, and that understanding those principles is essential to survival. Through this lens, the Anunnaki are not relics of a forgotten mythology, but enduring symbols of humanity's attempt to make sense of existence. They represent the earliest articulation of a worldview that seeks harmony between chaos and order, freedom and responsibility, power and restraint. In recognizing this legacy, we see that the ancient world was not primitive in its thinking, but profoundly sophisticated. Its myths were not mere stories, but frameworks for understanding reality. The Anunnaki, in this light, stand not as gods to be worshipped, but as enduring symbols of humanity's quest to comprehend the forces that shape existence itself. As centuries unfolded and civilizations rose upon the foundations laid by earlier cultures, the memory of the Anunnaki continued to transform, adapting to new worldviews while preserving its essential structure. What had once been understood as living divine authorities gradually became embedded within systems of thought that transcended mythology. Their presence persisted not as figures walking among humanity, but as enduring principles shaping the architecture of belief, governance, and morality. In this transition, the divine ceased to be immediate and tangible, yet it did not disappear. Instead, it became abstracted into concepts that guided behavior and defined order. The forces once personified as gods were absorbed into ideas such as fate, destiny, justice, and cosmic law. These ideas no longer required anthropomorphic form to exert influence. They existed as assumptions woven into the fabric of culture, guiding behavior without requiring constant mythic reaffirmations. As writing systems matured and philosophical traditions developed, the narrative of the gods evolved into frameworks of thought. Ancient cosmologies gave way to metaphysical systems that sought to explain existence through reason as much as reverence. Yet beneath these intellectual developments lay the same foundational assumptions inherited from the earliest myths: that the universe operates according to structure, that balance is essential, and that disorder carries consequence. The transformation of divine authority into abstract principle marked a significant shift in human self-understanding. responsibility increasingly rested with human institutions rather than supernatural intervention. Law, ethics, and governance became mechanisms through which cosmic order was maintained. What was once enforced by divine decree became embedded in social contracts and moral codes. This evolution did not eliminate the sacred, it redefined it. Sacredness became associated not with divine personalities, but with ideals such as justice, harmony, and truth. These ideals, though no longer personified, retained a transcendent quality. They demanded adherence, inspired reverence, and shaped collective behavior. In this sense, the legacy of the Anunnaki persisted as an invisible architecture underpinning civilization. The ancient belief in a universe governed by order informed the development of legal systems, philosophical inquiry, and ethical thought. Even as societies became more secular, they continued to operate within frameworks that assumed the existence of universal principles governing human conduct. The endurance of these concepts reveals their profound resonance with human experience. The idea that actions have consequences, that balance must be maintained, and that disorder invites collapse remains central to social organization. These principles, once attributed to divine will, became embedded in the logic of governance and the expectations of community life. As empires rose and fell, each inherited fragments of this ancient worldview. Empires adapted the symbols and narratives of the past to legitimize their authority. Rulers claimed divine favor or cosmic mandate, echoing the ancient belief that power derived from alignment with higher order. Even when the gods themselves faded from public consciousness, the structures they inspired persisted. The persistence of these ideas demonstrates how deeply they resonate with human cognition. The human mind seeks patterns, meaning, and coherence. The concept of a structured universe governed by consistent principles satisfies this need, offering a framework within which experience can be understood. The Anunnaki, in their symbolic capacity, fulfilled this role for early civilizations and continue to influence thought in subtler forms. Over time, philosophical inquiry began to replace mythological narrative as the primary means of understanding existence. Thinkers questioned the nature of reality, causality, and morality using reason rather than divine myth. Yet even in these intellectual pursuits, the shadow of ancient belief remained. Concepts such as natural law, moral order, and universal reason echoed the earlier conviction that the universe operates according to discernible principles. The transition from myth to philosophy did not erase the past, it reframed it. The gods became metaphors for forces that could be studied, debated, and interpreted. The language changed, but the underlying questions remained the same. What governs the world? What gives life meaning? What responsibilities do individuals bear within a larger system? In this way, the Anunnaki can be seen not as relics of superstition, but as early expressions of humanity's attempt to comprehend existence. Their stories encoded insights about power, limitation, and responsibility that continue to resonate. The form changed, but the function endured. Even in modern times, echoes of these ancient beliefs persist. Legal systems reflect the idea of cosmic justice. Ethical philosophies grapple with questions of balance and duty. Scientific inquiry seeks underlying laws that govern reality. In each case, the impulse to understand and order the world reflects the same impulse that gave rise to the earliest myths. The endurance of these ideas suggests that they address fundamental aspects of the human condition. They provide a framework for understanding complexity, for navigating uncertainty, and for finding meaning in a vast and often indifferent universe. The Anunnaki, as embodiments of order and authority, symbolize this enduring quest for comprehension. Through centuries of reinterpretation, their essence has been preserved even as their forms have changed. They are no longer worshipped as gods, yet their influence persists in the structures of thought that shape human civilization. Their legacy is not found in temples or rituals, but in the enduring belief that the world operates according to principles that can be understood, respected, and upheld. In this way, the story of the Anunnaki transcends its mythological origins. It becomes a reflection of humanity's ongoing effort to impose meaning on existence, to reconcile freedom with order, and to navigate the delicate balance between chaos and structure. This legacy continues to shape the human journey, reminding us that the search for understanding is as ancient as civilization itself. As the ancient world moved further into recorded history, the symbolic structures inherited from the earliest civilizations continued to shape human consciousness in quieter, subtler ways. The gods no longer appeared as towering figures commanding storms or issuing decrees from celestial thrones, yet their influence endured within the frameworks of culture, law, and belief. What had once been divine presence became inherited memory, woven into language, ritual, and the very architecture of thought. The transition from mythic understanding to philosophical inquiry did not erase the old worldview. It absorbed and refined it. Concepts once embodied by deities were recast as abstract principles. Justice, once personified by divine figures who weighed the fate of humanity, became an ethical ideal upheld by institutions. Order, once maintained through ritual and sacrifice, transformed into social structure and governance. The divine did not disappear, it was internalized. This transformation marked a turning point in human consciousness. The universe was no longer animated by visible gods, yet it remained governed by unseen laws, meaning no longer depended on divine intervention, but on interpretation, reason, and moral reflection. Humanity began to see itself not merely as subject to cosmic forces, but as a participant in shaping its own destiny within the constraints of an ordered world. Despite this shift, echoes of the ancient worldview persisted. The belief that actions carry consequences beyond the immediate moment endured. The idea that harmony must be preserved, that imbalance leads to disorder, continued to influence moral systems and social structures. These ideas, rooted in early myth, became foundational principles guiding civilizations long after their origins were forgotten. The transition from myth to philosophy did not occur abruptly. It unfolded over centuries, shaped by dialogue between tradition and innovation. As literacy spread and intellectual inquiry deepened, the symbolic language of myth gave way to conceptual frameworks. Yet the underlying truths remained strikingly similar. The cosmos was still understood as governed by order. Humanity still sought meaning within that order. Even as religious expression evolved, the fundamental concerns persisted. Societies continued to grapple with questions of justice, responsibility, and the limits of human power. The gods may have receded from direct involvement, but their legacy endured in the moral and philosophical systems that replaced them. In this way, the Anunnaki became more than ancient deities. They became archetypes representing humanity's attempt to comprehend its place within a vast and complex universe. Their stories encoded insights about authority, limitation, and balance that transcended cultural boundaries. They offered a framework for understanding existence that could be adapted across time and context. The endurance of these ideas suggests that they addressed something deeply human: the need to explain why the world is structured as it is, why suffering exists, and how order can emerge from chaos are questions that transcend era and culture. The early myths provided answers not through empirical observation, but through narrative structure, offering coherence in a world that often appeared unpredictable. As societies evolved, these narratives were reinterpreted through philosophy, theology, and science. Each new framework reframed the same fundamental questions, replacing divine agency with natural law or rational inquiry. Yet the underlying impulse remained constant: to find meaning in the patterns of existence. In this sense, the legacy of the Anunnaki is not confined to ancient texts or forgotten temples. It lives on in the human impulse to seek order, to understand cause and effect, and to construct systems that make sense of experience. Their stories are early expressions of humanity's enduring quest to comprehend the forces that shape reality. The persistence of these themes across millennia suggests that they speak to something essential within the human condition. They reflect a recognition that life operates within constraints, that freedom exists alongside limitation, and that meaning emerges through engagement with these boundaries. As modern thought continues to evolve, the ancient narratives retain their relevance, not as literal accounts, but as symbolic frameworks. They remind us that the search for understanding is not new, and that each generation inherits both the questions and the tools to address them. In this way, the legacy of the Anunnaki transcends myth. It becomes part of the intellectual lineage of humanity, a testament to the enduring effort to comprehend existence itself. Their stories endure not because they describe literal events, but because they articulate timeless truths about order, responsibility, and the human condition. Through this lens, the ancient world speaks across time, offering insight into the foundations of thought that continue to shape modern consciousness. The Anunnaki, once gods of clay and myth, remain relevant as symbols of humanity's earliest attempts to understand the structure of reality and humanity's place within it. As centuries turned into millennia, the ancient frameworks that once defined divine order did not disappear. They transformed. The language of gods and cosmic hierarchy gave way to new systems of meaning, but the structural logic remained deeply embedded in human consciousness. The Anunnaki, once conceived as literal beings who governed the universe, gradually became symbolic anchors for understanding authority, responsibility, and the limits of human power. Their presence lingered not as memory, but as pattern. The transition from mythic thinking to philosophical reasoning did not erase the old structures, it refined them. What had once been expressed through divine narrative became expressed through principle, law, and abstraction. Where gods once judged, now concepts like justice, reason, and natural law assumed the role of arbiter. The divine voice faded, but its function endured. This transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over generations as societies grew more complex and self-aware. As humans gained the ability to record, reflect, and analyze, the stories of gods became tools for contemplation rather than literal accounts of the world. Yet the underlying questions remained unchanged. What governs existence? What gives authority legitimacy? What binds individuals to a larger order? The answers offered by ancient myth did not vanish. They evolved. The idea that power must be constrained by law, that authority carries responsibility, and that chaos must be restrained by structure persisted across cultures and eras. These ideas migrated into philosophy, law, and governance, shaping civilizations long after the original gods had faded from worship. In this way, the Anunnaki became more than characters in a mythological narrative. They became archetypes, representations of enduring principles that transcended their original context. They embodied the tension between order and chaos, freedom and obligation, creation and destruction. Their stories articulated truths about the human condition that remained relevant even as belief systems changed. This continuity reveals something profound about the nature of myth itself. Myths are not merely primitive explanations of natural phenomena. They are frameworks through which societies express their deepest values and fears. They encode lessons about power, responsibility, and the consequences of excess. Through myth, abstract truths become accessible, memorable, and transmissible across generations. As human societies grew more complex, the need for such frameworks did not diminish. Instead, it intensified. The rise of cities, laws, and empires created new challenges that required moral and philosophical guidance. The ancient myths provided a foundation upon which these new systems could be built. In this context, the Anunnaki represent more than divine beings. They embody the principle of governance itself. Their stories reflect humanity's attempt to understand how order emerges from chaos, how authority should be exercised, and how balance can be maintained in an unpredictable world. These are not questions confined to antiquity. They are universal and timeless. The endurance of these ideas is evident in the way modern societies continue to grapple with similar concerns. Concepts such as justice, accountability, and social order remain central to human organization. Though the language has changed, the underlying questions remain remarkably consistent. Even in secular contexts, the legacy of these ancient frameworks persists. Legal systems, ethical theories, and political institutions all bear traces of the ancient conviction that order must be maintained and that power carries responsibility. The belief that actions have consequences, that systems must be governed by rules, and that balance is essential to stability echoes the logic of the earliest myths. This continuity suggests that the human mind seeks patterns that provide coherence and meaning. The stories of the Anunnaki offered a way to interpret the world's complexity, to make sense of suffering and change. They provided a narrative structure through which people could understand their place in the cosmos. As humanity's understanding of the universe expanded, the symbolic language of these myths adapted. The gods receded, but the principles they embodied persisted. The cosmos became governed by natural laws rather than divine decree, yet the sense of order remained. In this way, ancient myth laid the groundwork for scientific inquiry, philosophical reflection, and ethical reasoning. The persistence of these ideas demonstrates that the human search for meaning is continuous. Each generation reinterprets inherited concepts, reshaping them to fit new contexts. The Anunnaki, once literal deities, became metaphors for forces that continue to shape human existence: power, order, responsibility, and balance. Through this lens, the ancient myths are not relics of a primitive past, but foundational narratives that continue to inform human thought. They remind us that our understanding of the world is built upon layers of interpretation, each influenced by those that came before. The story of the Anunnaki, therefore, is not confined to ancient tablets or forgotten temples. It is embedded in the evolution of human consciousness itself. It reflects humanity's enduring effort to comprehend the structure of reality and to find meaning within it. As long as people seek to understand their place in the world, the questions first articulated through these ancient narratives will remain relevant. The gods may no longer walk among us, but the ideas they represented continue to shape how we think, govern, and live. In this sense, the legacy of the Anunnaki is not a relic of the past, but a living framework, an enduring testament to humanity's quest for order, meaning, and understanding in a vast and often mysterious universe. As human civilization continued its long progression through time, the ancient structures of meaning forged in early myth did not disappear. They evolved, embedded themselves deeper into the architecture of thought. The world changed, cities expanded, empires rose and fell, technologies transformed daily life. But the underlying need to explain existence remained constant. The Anunnaki, once imagined as divine arbiters shaping the fate of humanity, gradually transformed into abstract principles embedded within cultural consciousness. This evolution marked a shift from external divine governance to internalized systems of order. Where once the gods were believed to walk among mortals, their authority became encoded in institutions, traditions, and philosophies. Law replaced ritual as the primary instrument of order, yet its legitimacy still echoed divine origin. Justice was no longer dispensed by gods seated in celestial assemblies, but by human institutions claiming moral authority derived from transcendent principles. This transition did not signify the disappearance of the sacred. Instead, it represented its transformation. The sacred moved inward, becoming embedded within conscience, ethics, and collective norms. The sense that certain rules were inviolable, that there existed an unseen structure governing right and wrong, persisted. What changed was the language used to express it. In this way, the ancient worldview adapted to new realities. As societies became more complex and interconnected, their belief systems grew more abstract. The gods of storm and harvest gave way to concepts such as justice, reason, and law. These abstractions carried the same weight as their mythic predecessors, shaping behavior and legitimizing authority. The legacy of the Anunnaki thus extended beyond religion into the very foundations of civilization. Legal systems, political hierarchies, and ethical codes all reflect the ancient conviction that order must be maintained and that authority derives from something greater than individual will. This continuity reveals a deep-rooted human need for structure and meaning. As philosophical traditions emerged, they reinterpreted the old myths through rational frameworks. Thinkers sought to understand the principles governing existence without reliance on divine narrative. Yet even in these rational systems, echoes of the old cosmology remained. Concepts such as natural law, moral order, and universal reason bore the imprint of earlier mythic structures. The transformation from myth to philosophy did not erase the past. It recontextualized it. The Anunnaki became symbolic representations of forces that humans sought to understand through reason rather than reverence. Their stories were no longer taken as literal truth, but as allegories expressing deeper truths about human existence. This process reflects a broader pattern in human development, the movement from concrete myth to abstract thought. As societies matured, their explanations of the world grew more complex and nuanced. The gods of old were not discarded, but internalized, their functions absorbed into evolving systems of thought. Even in modern times, traces of these ancient beliefs persist. Concepts such as justice, order, and moral obligation continue to shape human behavior. Though framed in secular language, they retain the structure of ancient cosmologies. The idea that actions have consequences, that balance must be maintained, and that disorder leads to suffering echoes the worldview of the earliest civilizations. The enduring influence of these ideas speaks to their foundational role in human cognition. They provide a framework for understanding the world and our place within it. By offering a sense of coherence and purpose, they address fundamental human concerns that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. In this sense, the legacy of the Anunnaki extends beyond mythology into the very fabric of human thought. Their stories represent humanity's earliest attempts to articulate a coherent vision of existence, one that acknowledges both the power and the limits of human agency. As modern societies grapple with complex challenges, the underlying themes of these ancient narratives remain relevant. Questions of authority, responsibility, and balance continue to shape political and ethical discourse. The ancient insights encoded in myth still resonate, offering guidance in navigating an increasingly complex world. The enduring appeal of these stories lies in their capacity to speak across time. They address universal concerns that transcend specific historical contexts. By exploring the nature of order, power, and meaning, they provide a framework through which humanity can understand itself. In recognizing this continuity, we see that the myths of the past are not relics but living ideas. They evolve alongside human thought, adapting to new contexts while retaining their core significance. The Anunnaki, once revered as gods, now endure as symbols of humanity's enduring quest to comprehend the forces that shape existence. Their legacy reminds us that beneath the layers of culture, technology, and ideology lies a shared human impulse, the desire to understand the world and our place within it. This impulse has driven myth, philosophy, and science alike, linking ancient civilizations to the present in an unbroken chain of inquiry. Through this lens, the story of the Anunnaki becomes more than a tale of ancient gods. It becomes a reflection of humanity's enduring search for meaning, order, and understanding. A journey that continues to unfold with each generation, guided by the same questions that first inspired our ancestors to look toward the heavens and wonder. As the long arc of human civilization continued its slow unfolding, the echoes of ancient cosmologies did not fade into silence. Instead, they settled into the foundation of thought itself, shaping how societies understood authority, morality, and the unseen forces guiding existence. What once had been expressed through gods and myths gradually transformed into systems of belief that no longer required divine faces, yet still carried the same structural logic. The Anunnaki, though no longer worshipped by name, lived on as conceptual forces shaping the architecture of human understanding. With the rise of empires and the spread of written law, humanity began to externalize what had once been internalized through myth. The idea that the universe operated according to rules became the foundation for legal codes, ethical frameworks, and systems of governance. Order was no longer enforced solely by fear of divine retribution, but by institutions claiming legitimacy through tradition, authority, and moral reasoning. The gods receded, but their functions remained intact. This transformation did not diminish the sense of cosmic order. It reframed it. Where earlier cultures spoke of divine judgment, later societies spoke of justice. Where ancient myths described balance maintained by supernatural beings, later philosophies articulated harmony through rational principles. Yet the underlying assumption remained unchanged. The universe is governed by structure, and humanity must align itself with that structure to survive. The persistence of this idea reveals something fundamental about human cognition. People have always sought patterns in chaos, explanations for suffering, and frameworks through which meaning can be derived. The Anunnaki represented an early attempt to articulate these needs in narrative form. As time progressed, those narratives evolved into ethical systems, political theories, and scientific worldviews, each reflecting the same core impulse to impose order on uncertainty. In this evolution, the gods became metaphors for forces that could not be directly observed, but were nonetheless experienced. Justice, fate, and destiny were no longer personified as deities, yet they remained central to human understanding. The language changed, but the concepts endured. Humanity continued to search for balance between freedom and constraint, chaos and structure, individuality and collective order. This continuity suggests that the ancient myths were not primitive errors but early expressions of universal concerns. They represented humanity's first attempts to articulate the relationship between individual agency and cosmic necessity. Through myth, early societies grappled with the same questions that philosophers and scientists would later explore through reason and observation. As civilizations advanced, the focus shifted from appeasing gods to understanding natural laws, yet the impulse to find meaning persisted. The laws of physics replaced divine decree, but they served a similar function: to explain how the universe operates and to provide a framework within which human life could be understood. In this sense, science did not replace myth so much as inherit its role. The enduring influence of the Anunnaki can thus be seen in the way modern societies conceptualize authority and responsibility. Governments, legal systems, and moral codes all rest on the assumption that order is necessary and that chaos must be restrained. This assumption echoes the ancient belief that the cosmos itself demands balance. Even today, language reflects this inheritance. Terms such as natural law, cosmic order, and universal principles echo the ancient conviction that reality is governed by overarching rules. Though stripped of mythological imagery, these ideas continue to shape how humans understand their place in the world. The persistence of these concepts suggests that the human mind is wired to seek coherence. Faced with the vastness and unpredictability of existence, people instinctively search for patterns that offer meaning and stability. The Anunnaki, in their time, served as embodiments of this search. They represented humanity's effort to comprehend forces beyond immediate control. As societies evolved, the need for such symbols did not vanish. It transformed. Where ancient peoples saw gods, later generations saw systems, laws, and principles. The names changed, but the underlying need for order remained constant. In this way, the story of the Anunnaki is not confined to ancient mythology. It is part of a continuous intellectual lineage that extends into the present. The same impulse that led early civilizations to personify cosmic forces now drives scientific inquiry, philosophical debate, and ethical reflection. The enduring relevance of these ancient concepts lies in their ability to address fundamental questions. How should power be exercised? What governs human behavior? How can order be maintained in a complex and unpredictable world? These questions have no final answers, but the attempt to answer them defines human civilization. Through the lens of the Anunnaki, we see the origins of this quest. Their stories capture humanity's earliest efforts to make sense of existence, to impose structure on chaos, and to find meaning in the vastness of the unknown. Though the language has changed, the underlying pursuit remains the same. As long as humans seek to understand their place in the universe, the legacy of these ancient narratives will endure. They remind us that our search for meaning is as old as civilization itself, and that the structures we build, whether mythological, philosophical, or scientific, are all expressions of a timeless human impulse to comprehend the world and our role within it. As the long arc of human memory stretches toward the present, the ancient voices that once spoke through myth and ritual continue to echo beneath the surface of modern thought. The world has changed beyond recognition since the first stories of the Anunnaki were etched into clay, yet the structures those stories expressed remain deeply embedded in the foundations of civilization. What began as myth became worldview. What once explained the cosmos now underlies how humanity understands order, authority, and meaning itself. The transformation from myth to abstraction did not erase the past. It concealed it beneath layers of philosophy, science, and institutional thought. The gods receded from view, but the principles they embodied persisted. Authority no longer wore the faces of divine beings, yet it continued to operate through systems that mirrored their logic. Law replaced divine decree, bureaucracy replaced ritual, and ideology replaced mythology, but the underlying structure remained strikingly familiar. At the heart of this continuity lies a fundamental human need, the need to believe that existence is not arbitrary. From the earliest myths to modern theories of governance and science, humanity has sought reassurance that the universe operates according to intelligible rules. The Anunnaki once represented that order in personal form, giving face and narrative to the forces that shaped life. As understanding evolved, those forces became abstract principles, but their function remained the same. The modern world often prides itself on having moved beyond myth, yet it continues to rely on inherited frameworks that echo ancient patterns. Concepts such as natural law, moral responsibility, and systemic order carry the imprint of the same worldview that once envisioned gods overseeing the balance of creation. Even the idea of progress itself, the belief that history moves toward improvement, reflects an underlying faith in order and purpose. In this way, the ancient stories have not been discarded. They have been translated. Where once people spoke of divine judgment, they now speak of justice systems. Where they once feared the wrath of gods, they now fear the consequences of social collapse or ecological imbalance. The language has changed, but the underlying anxieties and aspirations remain remarkably consistent. The endurance of these patterns suggests that the Anunnaki were never merely figures of imagination. They were symbolic representations of humanity's attempt to understand and manage the forces shaping existence. Their stories offered frameworks for interpreting the unknown, providing structure in a world that often appeared chaotic and indifferent. As societies evolved, these frameworks became increasingly internalized. Authority shifted from external deities to internalized norms. Morality became a matter of conscience rather than divine command. Yet the impulse to seek order persisted, driving the development of ethics, law, and science. In this sense, the Anunnaki did not disappear. They transformed. Their legacy lives on in the assumptions that underpin modern civilization: that the universe is governed by consistent principles, that human actions have consequences, and that order can be understood and maintained. These ideas, once expressed through myth, now find expression in institutions, theories, and cultural norms. The continuity of these ideas reveals a profound truth about human nature. Across cultures and epochs, people have sought meaning through structure. They have looked to the heavens, to the earth, and to their own societies for signs of order amid chaos. The stories they told were reflections of this search, attempts to articulate a coherent vision of reality. The Anunnaki, in this light, are not relics of a forgotten past, but symbols of an enduring human impulse. They represent the effort to reconcile the unknown with the knowable, to impose coherence on a vast and unpredictable universe. Their legacy persists not because of literal belief, but because the questions they embodied remain unanswered. As humanity continues to explore the nature of existence, the ancient patterns endure. Science seeks laws, philosophy seeks meaning, and culture seeks narratives that connect the individual to the whole. Each of these pursuits echoes the same fundamental desire that gave rise to the earliest myths. The journey from myth to modernity has not diminished the significance of these ancient ideas. It has reframed them. Where once gods explained the movement of the stars, now equations do. Where once divine judgment enforced order, now legal and ethical systems perform that role. The forms have changed, but the underlying impulse remains constant. In this way, the legacy of the Anunnaki extends beyond their historical context. They symbolize humanity's enduring effort to understand the universe and its place within it. Their stories remind us that behind every system of thought lies a deeper human longing for meaning, coherence, and connection. As long as humanity continues to question, to seek patterns, and to strive for understanding, the spirit embodied by these ancient figures will persist. They are not relics of a forgotten age, but expressions of an enduring quest, one that began in the earliest days of civilization and continues, in new forms, to shape the human story. The tale of the Anunnaki, then, is not merely a story of gods and myths. It is a reflection of humanity's evolving consciousness, a mirror held up to our deepest questions about existence, order, and purpose. In this sense, their legacy is not confined to the past. It lives on in every attempt to make sense of the world and our place within it.